Today, I'm going to tell you some things you should know before you move to the Rose City, Portland, Oregon. Have you ever thought about relocating to the Pacific Northwest? Maybe you looked at Seattle, but you want a smaller city? Well, the smaller version of Seattle is called Portland, Oregon, and it's just down the road a couple hours. For many years, Portland has been one of the hottest relocation spots. It started around the late 80s, maybe early 90s, about the time the shine came off of California for young adults. Enough of them finally made it to Los Angeles and realized that just because you showed up and you were homecoming queen back in Idaho doesn't mean you're going to be a movie star in Los Angeles. Portland was in the top 10 for the most moved to states every single year for almost 20 years. In the last 3 or 4 years, it's dropped out of the top 15, and I think it's going to continue to slide, at least for a while. Now, full disclosure, I live in the Portland metro area. I love this city even though it's not its greatest version right now. Maybe that'll change, hopefully sooner than later. This video has 10 things, both good and bad, you need to know about Portland, Oregon before you decide to move here. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. Number 10, do your research on the neighborhoods. Now, Portland, like all major cities, has its good neighborhoods and its bad neighborhoods. It's good suburbs and it's bad suburbs. Most of the time, most cities, you could tell if it's good or bad by the price. That's really not as much a thing in Portland for some reason. There's a few reasons for that, and we'll get into them later. But some neighborhoods you should probably avoid. I wouldn't really be moving to downtown. Too much goes on around there that you really don't need to be living there. The Pearl District is nice, but it has some spots on the eastern side of it that you should probably avoid. Old Town is horrible. North Portland don't go to, and Northeast Portland ain't great either. You have some good suburbs like Beaverton, Tigard, even Hillsboro. You have neighborhoods like Cedar Hills, West Slope, West Haven, Sylvan, Metzger. Those are all really nice places to live. You just gotta make sure you're going to the right one, and the best piece of advice is stay away from anything near the airport, and downtown isn't a place you want to live. Number 9, the public schools kind of blow. This is one of those things I really should have researched before I moved here. My kids were in high school, middle school, and one was in elementary school when we got here to the Portland metro area. And Oregon ain't great. They're ranked 35th in the nation, and Portland isn't helping out with that ranking at all. I imagine it's kind of like an anchor, just dragging them down. Now, I know the comments section will be filled with all kinds of examples of really good schools they have in the Portland area. And that's great. I'm sure they do have some really nice schools. But we're talking about the average. And the average for Portland when it comes to education is horrible. Kids really aren't getting out of these schools with the life skills and the training that they need. I mean, one of the biggest employers in this city is strip clubs. Number 8, the protesters. Portland has always been up for a good protest. I mean, since I've been here, I've seen several different movements from Occupy Wall Street around 2010, 2011 to George Floyd in 2020 and everything in between. Now that I've said that, the comment section will be filled with people saying that Antifa started in Portland, Oregon. It did not. People always say Portland's like Antifa headquarters, like they have a shop or something like that and they're giving out franchises. It actually started in Europe, Italy to be exact, and it had to do with Benito Mussolini. Now, what is known as modern Antifa started in the 1970s and 1980s. So the anti-fascist movement went by all kinds of different names, but the actual word Antifa did start in Portland, Oregon in 2007. Now, I enjoy a good protest just as much as the next person, but at some point, the protests in Portland, Oregon get to be a little much. I mean, anything and everything will set off a protest, and for some reason, in recent years, every single one of them spills out onto the freeway or they start blocking trains. How's that getting your point across? You're just inconveniencing the general population. You're mad at the government, so you want to screw with the average Joe's day. You're stopping people from getting home from work. How does that make sense? You want to turn the populace against you? Make them late for Jeopardy. Yeah, but it's just a big pain in the ass here in Portland with all the different protests. We haven't had one in a couple years, but it's just a matter of time. Number 7, the cost of living. The cost of living in Portland is 24% above the national average. One of the reasons people used to move here back in the day is it was a cheap place to live. Right now, overall, 24% above the national average. Goods and services are about 20% above the national average. On top of that, they got a pretty steep state income tax, and it really sucks because directly across the border in Washington, they have no state income tax. Number 6, crime is on the rise. When I first started doing these videos, I looked at Portland's crime rate and I went back and researched a little bit. It was only 34% above the national average. That was in 2016, 2017. It stayed right around that area. Right now, the overall crime rate in Portland, Oregon is 124% above the national average. Now, they've always had a very low violent crime rate, but in recent years, that's been on the rise. It's now 35% above the national average. You never used to hear about shootings in Portland, Oregon. I promise you, there'll be one on the news tonight, and then there'll be one on the news tomorrow night. There seems to be at least one every single night. Sure, that's better than places like Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, when they have so many shootings, they don't even bother reporting it on the news. But compared to how it was 3, 4, 5 years ago, it's a big difference. Their property crime's always been kind of high because of the homeless population. We'll get into that later. Number 5, a housing shortage. There's a housing and affordable housing shortage in Portland, Oregon. It's gotten better in the last few years, but we're going to feel the effects for another decade at least. For a really long time, there was no new construction. And if they did build anything, it was usually someone's very expensive home or a very expensive apartment building. There was no affordable apartment buildings built in decades. That led to a lot of people living in their cars. And as the homeless situation blew up, again, we'll talk about that later, this became more of a thing. I know a street right now where there are vans just parked up alongside it. It's like a mile of bumper to bumper vans parked on the side of the road, vans, motorhomes, things like that. People cooking in their barbecue on the sidewalk because that's where they live. That's their own neighborhood within a neighborhood. Why? Because there's no affordable housing in Portland. Oregon Public Broadcasting conducted a poll on issues potential Oregon voters are most concerned about. And the results went like this. The biggest was the homelessness, with 29% saying that this was their biggest concern, followed by government leadership at 22%, crime at 16%, housing and rent control at 6%. Housing and rent control beat things like jobs, economy, environment, drug addiction, climate change, health and mental health, education, traffic and transportation, and even COVID mandates. That's not as much of a thing anymore, but earlier this year when they did the study, that was a big thing. Housing and rent control beat all of those. Number 4, the great outdoors. If you move to Portland, you should probably have a good pair of hiking shoes, a mountain bike, something like that, because you will eventually end up outdoors enjoying nature. That's just what they do here in Portland, Oregon. Even in the rain, they get out there and they hike, they walk around in the woods, and there's plenty of that to do here. If you move here and you're not into that type of thing, one of Portland's best features will be lost on you. Portland always seems to show up on those lists for the outdoor types, best parks, best hiking trails, things like that. We have a giant park here called Washington Park. That's where you'll find the zoo, the Portland Japanese Garden, the Rose Garden, the World Forestry Center, things like that. And then you also have an area called Forest Park, which is great for hiking. You can get in there and actually forget you're really close to a city. Matter of fact, it's so big, a guy and his daughter lived in there for a few years. They lost their home and they just got a tent and went and hid in this Forest Park area and nobody found them for like 3 years. There was a movie made about them. Well, it was loosely based on their situation, but she continued to go to school while living in the park. You got the coast not too far away. You got the Columbia and the Willamette River here. And of course, Mount Hood isn't too far away either. Number 3, loose morals. Yeah, when it comes to what most people would think as morality, we really don't get into it too much here in Portland, Oregon. Matter of fact, per capita, we have more strip clubs than any other city. The only one that's close is Tampa. Oddly enough, Tampa and Portland are 2 of the least church-going cities in the nation. We are also one of the first states to legalize the devil's lettuce. The state of Oregon has more breweries per capita than any other state. When you just look at the cities, Portland, Maine is number 1 with 18. And Portland, Oregon is tied for 5, 6, 7, and 8 with 10 breweries per 50,000 residents. On top of that, we have a nude beach down by the river, and we have a naked bike ride every year. Other cities have the naked bike ride, but Portland has one of the biggest naked bike rides, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A bunch of people get on their bikes at night, and they ride through the streets naked. They have a route. They're not going by people's homes or anything like that. It's mostly across the bridges and industrial parks and commercial areas, but still, it's a naked bike ride, and it's huge. The bike ride is, at least. I mean, as far as participants go, it's huge. Wasn't saying anything weird. Number 3, you don't need a car. Portland, Oregon is one of the most walkable cities in the nation. Along with that, it's always in the top 10 when it comes to public transportation. They have a whole train system downtown with trolleys going east, west, north, south, all that good stuff. You can get in the train on the west side of town in Beaverton, where I live, and take it all the way to the airport, which is on the northeast side of Portland, Oregon. It's like an hour and 20-minute train ride, but it drops you off less than 100 yards away from the check-in counter at the Portland International Airport. And unlike other places, people really enjoy, I wouldn't say they enjoy the train, but they like it. They get on it. It's crowded all the time. You got to stand up a lot. It's decent. It's clean. Sure, they've had a couple problems on it in the last few years. Some guy stabbed some people on there, but I mean, that can happen in any major city. All right, before we get to number one, here's some things that everybody knows about, and I'm going to get a bunch of grief if I don't mention them. It rains here all the time, all the time. The summers are beautiful, but the rest of the year it rains with the occasional snowstorm, or at least a dusting. If you don't like the rain, you probably shouldn't move to Oregon. On top of that, you don't have to pump your own gas here. There's laws against that. It is a very liberal city. If that's not your thing, and that bothers you, you might not want to move here. And I know we talked about the rent earlier, but housing prices are through the roof here too. All right, on to number one. And number one, the homeless situation. There's a lot of cities, especially on the West Coast, that have an epidemic of homelessness. A lot of it has to do with a lot of different reasons. We just talked about the San Francisco situation. Then in our last video, we talked about how bad it is in Los Angeles, which is by far the worst of any other city. Los Angeles is just out of control. Portland is pretty bad. In recent months, we've been making some great strides to get people off the streets, and downtown looks a lot better compared to the height of the pandemic. But they got a long way to go before they can really say they've made some serious progress. Some of it has to do with the affordable housing and rent costs and stuff like that, and that is a problem and that does contribute to it. But the real problem is the mental health and the addiction side of the homelessness here in Portland, Oregon. Portland has a slogan, "Keep Portland Weird." Well, that slogan and the way this city is brings in a lot of people that are kind of weird. Sometimes that weirdness comes from a little mental illness. I'm not trying to rag on the homeless, and I'm not making light of anyone with any kind of mental issues. It's a horrible situation. I'm just giving you the facts that weird places bring in people with some problems. There are parts of Portland that I know really well, and I won't even go there, day or night. One of them was Old Town. We talked about Old Town earlier. Don't move to Old Town. Yeah, that's part of the reason. The Chinatown area, don't go around there. I was down that area one time near Voodoo Donuts, and I saw a girl right off to the side where the line is for Voodoo Donuts. She was actually having an argument with a stuffed animal. She was obviously homeless and suffering from something. I don't know what was going on upstairs, but it wasn't good because she was having an argument with a stuffed animal. To make it better, another homeless person came by and said, "That's not what he said," talking about the stuffed animal. Then they started arguing to what the stuffed animal was saying. Strangest thing I ever saw. I actually thought it was some kind of skit or street improvisation. No, they were serious. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Now go out, have a great day, be nice to each other.